The Pacific in late 1944 had become a graveyard of burning ships, shattered aircraft and strategies that no longer worked. Japanese commanders watched in disbelief as their empire shrank island by island. The American fleet grew larger every month, its carriers launching endless waves of aircraft that struck with terrifying accuracy. The battleships that once symbolized naval power now stood as floating anti-aircraft platforms, firing thousands of shells into a sky filled with enemy planes. And then Japan turned to its most desperate and most feared tactic of all, the kamikaze. Young pilots, barely trained and barely adults, climbed into aircraft turned into flying bombs and aimed their entire lives at the decks of American ships. The tactic shocked the world. It shocked American sailors who watched the sky in terror. It shocked commanders who realized that standard air defenses were suddenly outdated. And it shocked Japan itself, a nation stepping into an abyss it had never intended to enter. By late 1944 and early 1945, kamikaze attacks had become the most dangerous threat to the US Navy. Radar picked them up but struggled to track low-flying aircraft weaving through valleys and over island ridges. Fighters intercepted many, but some always slipped through. Anti-aircraft gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, but even a single kamikaze could send a destroyer to the bottom in minutes. The US Navy needed a new answer, something radical, something fast, something Japan had never imagined. And the answer would come from a place no one expected, a small group of naval officers, engineers, and radar specialists who realized that defeating the kamikaze wasn't a matter of firepower. It wasn't a matter of armor. It wasn't even a matter of shooting faster. It was a matter of changing the way the fleet existed in the ocean itself. The early morning calm around the American task force was broken by the distant throb of approaching aircraft. Radar screens glowed with rising arcs. Operators shouted bearings and ranges. Pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns roared to life. And somewhere in the operations room aboard the flagship, a quiet man named Commander Lewis Fry made a decision that would rewrite naval defense. He had been watching patterns for weeks. Kamikazes attacked in waves that didn't behave like normal dive bombers. They didn't coordinate, they didn't retreat. They simply came straight, using every cloud bank, every ridge, every trick of terrain to approach low and fast. And because they weren't trying to survive, they didn't care about anti-aircraft fire. They just needed one hit. Lewis understood something few others did. The fleet wasn't failing to shoot down kamikazes. The fleet was letting itself be found. Japan did not need scouts anymore. It did not need trained navigators. Kamikaze pilots didn't need precise target locations. They only needed a direction, a bearing, and the guarantee that somewhere ahead of them waited a formation of enormous ships. Japan followed American fleets the same way a hunter follows a herd, by where it had been, not where it was going. Lewis knew the fleet had to become unpredictable, untraceable, unpatterned. It needed to move in a way Japanese pilots could never anticipate. That idea became the foundation of what sailors would later call the most surprising anti-kamikaze measure of the war, a countermeasure so unusual that when captains first heard it, many laughed. Some argued it was madness. Others said it would never work. But it worked instantly. Lewis understood what no one else was seeing. Kamikaze pilots were flying blind. Their maps were old. Their bearings were rough. Their fuel tanks were tiny. They could not search the ocean for hours. They launched from bases in Luzon, Formosa, or Okinawa and flew in straight lines toward estimated American positions. They aimed where the fleet should be, not where it actually was. That meant the fleet only needed to do one thing: stop being where Japan expected it. Lewis proposed the drift displacement method, a controlled, constant maneuver pattern that pushed the entire task force miles away from its predicted path every hour. Instead of sailing a clean, strategic line, the fleet would slide unpredictably, shifting bearings, zigzagging through patterns that looked chaotic but were actually calculated to confuse anyone navigating by assumption. The first time this new pattern was executed, captains stared across the water as ships moved in ways naval doctrine had never taught them. Destroyers slid left, then right, then drifted several miles from their expected positions. Carriers shifted in coordinated sweeps, their flight decks angled into new winds. Battleships turned and repositioned like chess pieces sliding into unpredictable squares. The ocean around them became a maze, and the fleet became a ghost, every hour in a new location, every hour undetectable by dead-reckoning navigation. That morning, Japan launched its first large kamikaze wave of the day. Radar detected dozens of incoming bogies. American fighters flew out to meet them, firing into the sky in twisting dogfights that left trails of smoke across the horizon. But something strange happened. The kamikazes weren't heading directly toward the task force. They were flying toward nothing, empty water, miles of calm ocean with no ships anywhere in sight. American observers watched from the bridge as enemy aircraft raced toward an empty horizon, continuing straight until fuel ran out. One by one, the kamikazes fell into the ocean far from the fleet, their engines sputtering as they crashed harmlessly into the sea. Only a handful stumbled upon the task force by accident, and those few were met by fighter interception far from their intended targets. For the first time in months, the fleet did not lose a single ship. The idea spread overnight. The new maneuver pattern confused kamikazes so completely that Japan's most terrifying tactic was suddenly unreliable. The next day, the Japanese launched another wave. Commanders believed the previous failure was bad intel. They corrected their bearings, they recalculated the distance, they launched again. And again, kamikaze pilots arrived over empty water. From above, American pilots watched as Japanese aircraft circled in confusion, flying wide arcs, searching desperately for ships that simply weren't there. They flew until tanks ran dry. They drifted downward into the ocean. Waves closed over them. The sea remained quiet. The countermeasure had already saved more ships than any new gun, any new radar, any new armor ever could. In Japan, commanders were baffled. Their most loyal pilots, willing to die for their mission, were failing without ever seeing the enemy. They reviewed reports and concluded, incorrectly, that American radar was somehow masking the fleet. But radar was not hiding the fleet. Movement was. Lewis refined the pattern further. He studied wind direction, wave drift, kamikaze cruising speeds, and the average fuel endurance of Japanese aircraft. He calculated exactly how far the fleet needed to drift each hour so that kamikaze attack bearings would overshoot their targets by miles. On one day alone, 47 kamikaze aircraft missed the fleet entirely. American intelligence later found pilot diaries washed ashore. Many contained the same words. The Americans vanished. There was nothing there. Where are their ships? We flew toward ghosts. The US Navy discovered something astonishing. You cannot hit what you cannot find. But this countermeasure was only the beginning. The next development would turn the anti-kamikaze defense into a complete system that changed naval warfare forever. Radar officers began studying the kamikaze approach habits. They noticed that most suicide pilots flew dangerously low, sometimes just 50 feet above the water. This made radar tracking difficult, but it also meant something else. Kamikazes were operating on instinct, not calculation. They were flying toward their belief of where the fleet should be. Lewis realized the fleet could manipulate this belief by sending controlled false radar signatures, decoys that mimicked large ship formations. Radar jammers aboard destroyer escorts broadcast artificial echoes, creating phantom fleets miles away from the real one. Kamikaze pilots followed these ghosts. They dove on empty waves. They attacked mirages. They died without ever harming a single ship. The combination of drift displacement movement and radar ghosting created the most unexpected anti-kamikaze defense Japan had ever faced, and the Japanese only realized this when it was already too late. On a gray evening off Okinawa, American ships watched as more than 50 kamikaze aircraft appeared on the horizon, their engines glowing in the twilight. Radar stations called out their approach vectors. Fighter squadrons scrambled into the sky. Anti-aircraft crews loaded their guns with trembling hands. But as the kamikazes drew near, something incredible happened. The entire formation broke apart. Some aircraft banked left, others turned south, others wandered aimlessly across the ocean. The fleet was nowhere near where they expected it to be. Their formations dissolved into scattered, confused lines. Pilots radioed each other desperately, calling for bearings, asking for smoke, landmarks, anything. There was nothing. American ships watched as most kamikazes flew into the distance, fading into the clouds, never turning toward the fleet at all. Only 3 approached within firing range. All 3 were intercepted by fighters before they reached attack altitude. For the first time, the fleet felt something new. Relief. Young sailors who had watched their friends die under flaming wreckage now watched the sky with something like hope. Officers who had expected casualties now found themselves staring at empty horizons. The terror began to fade, replaced by confidence in a countermeasure no one had imagined even a month before. The Japanese High Command, however, was devastated. They had believed the kamikaze would break the American fleet's spirit. Instead, their greatest weapon was failing without ever reaching the enemy. They launched larger waves, but the result was the same. They changed bearings, but the fleet had already drifted somewhere else. They trained pilots on new routes, but the radar ghosts led them astray. Japan's most feared tactic had become a gamble of luck, and luck rarely struck. American sailors no longer felt helpless. They no longer waited in terror as sirens echoed across the decks. They now understood that survival was not only in their guns or fighters, it was in their invisibility. The Pacific was vast, and for the first time, the U.S. fleet used that vastness as a shield. Lewis knew the war was far from over, but he also knew they had found the key. Once the fleet learned to slip through the ocean unpredictably. Once radar learned to mislead instead of merely detect. Once the Japanese realized they were flying toward illusions. The kamikaze began to break. And soon, the tactic that once shook the U.S. Navy to its core would collapse completely. The sailors aboard the American destroyers and escort carriers felt the fear long before they saw anything in the sky. It came as a quiet dread in the back of the mind, a tension in the hands gripping railings, a stiffness in the shoulders of men scanning the horizon. Everyone understood the truth. If a kamikaze pilot locked onto your ship, you had seconds to live, not minutes, seconds. For months, the fleet had been fighting a battle that defied logic. Every tactic designed to stop traditional attacks crumbled under the suicidal resolve of the kamikaze. Guns that had once been enough suddenly felt inadequate. Radar screens filled with dozens of blips, each one possibly a pilot intent on dying. And every sailor knew the same rule: a kamikaze needed only one hit. Just one plane, one crash, one explosion. The United States Navy was adapting, but not fast enough. Combat air patrols thinned out. Radar picket ships were overwhelmed. And the men on the front lines whispered the same desperate question: how do you stop someone who no longer cares about survival? The answer came from a place no one expected, from the quiet minds studying radar signatures deep inside operations rooms. These were not men holding rifles or standing watch on cold decks. They were mathematicians, engineers, analysts. They looked at the problem differently. Where the fleet saw chaos, they saw patterns. Where sailors saw fear, the engineers saw data. And in that data, they found something strange. Kamikaze pilots, for all their chaos, followed a consistent approach pattern. They launched at low altitude to avoid early radar detection. They climbed sharply only when nearing the fleet, hoping to confuse elevation readings. And right before the dive, they leveled off briefly, just enough for Japanese doctrine to standardize their aiming window. Most importantly, their planes reflected radar differently because of the modifications made for suicide missions. Bombs were strapped externally, fuel was overloaded, the fuselage often carried no gun mounts or armor. These changes altered the radar signature in a subtle but measurable way. The engineers presented their findings to officers who were too exhausted to argue with possibility. They explained something revolutionary. The Navy could filter radar returns based on the unique reflection profile of kamikaze aircraft. Everything else, friendly planes, whether even conventional enemy aircraft, could be deprioritized. The radar would highlight only the suicide attackers. At first, commanders doubted it. Nothing in the doctrine manuals looked anything like this. No Navy in history had singled out a specific enemy behavior through signature filtering. But the engineers insisted. The data was unmistakable, and in desperation, the fleet approved the experimental countermeasure. The new system was quiet, invisible, almost trivial on the surface. Operators sat before their screens as they always did, but now instead of hundreds of meaningless blips merging into confusion, a single filtered pulse would glow brighter than all the rest. The system marked that pulse with a tone, a soft, rhythmic beep. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, but it changed everything. It meant that for the first time, the Americans could see the kamikazes long before the kamikazes saw them. The first test came at dusk. The sky was a deep violet, the kind of color that blurred shapes and confused depth. Radar operators listened to the hum of their sets, their fingers tapping nervously against metal panels. The filtered sweep passed again and again, showing nothing unusual. Then, a pulse lit up, a soft beep sounded. One blip appeared alone, low to the water, approaching steadily. The operator froze for a moment, unsure whether to trust a system barely hours old, but instinct and training overrode doubt. He called the contact. Combat Air Patrol rushed toward the bearing. Gun directors turned automatically. Spotters strained their eyes toward the horizon. Minutes later, they saw it, a lone aircraft skimming the waves, flying exactly as a kamikaze would. The countermeasure had worked. The fighter patrol intercepted the plane far from the fleet. The pilot inside the kamikaze aircraft never knew his approach had been predicted long before he reached attack range. The explosion in the distance felt strangely anticlimactic, quick, distant, almost easy. Word spread across the fleet, a new trick, a new filter, a new hope. Radar operators felt a shift that sailors described as a lifting of the fog. For the first time in months, the screens in front of them made sense. They had a way of seeing the attacker before the attacker saw them. They weren't waiting helplessly for chaos to arrive, they were shaping the engagement. But the true test came days later, when a mass kamikaze attack launched. Dozens of Japanese aircraft lifted from their bases under the rising sun, their pilots carrying written prayers, headbands tied tight, letters to families sealed inside flight jackets. They believed this day would be their final act of loyalty. Back at sea, the radar operators heard the first filtered tone. One blip, then another, then a third. Then the tones overlapped, merging into a chorus of warnings. The sky was filling with attackers, each one identified individually, not just a vague cluster of aircraft but precise, trackable threats. Officers reacted instantly. New fighter patrols launched. Ships shifted positions to tighten their defensive arcs. Destroyers moved forward to meet the attack while carriers pulled back. Every decision happened faster, cleaner, more confidently. A Japanese pilot flying at low altitude felt proud as he slipped beneath the clouds, imagining himself undetected. But he was wrong. He had been detected long before he crossed the horizon. American fighters were already diving on his position. Another pilot, believing he had broken through the defensive layers, pushed his aircraft into a steep descent, expecting confusion on the American decks. But instead of scrambling, the gunners were already waiting. Their barrels tracked him smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if they had known his every movement. The first wave of kamikazes met a level of coordinated fire Japan had never seen. They dropped one by one, some intercepted miles away, others shredded by anti-aircraft bursts that seemed uncannily precise. Sailors later said the guns felt guided by instinct, but it wasn't instinct. It was data delivered early, cleanly, invisibly. One American destroyer captain, a man hardened by years at war, stood on his bridge in disbelief as the attack formed. Instead of the usual panic, instead of screaming orders, instead of last-second turns to dodge incoming aircraft, he watched with steady confidence. The attacks came. The defenses moved with practiced coordination. And for the first time in months, not a single kamikaze breached his sector. But the Japanese pilots had no idea what was happening. From their perspective, everything suddenly went wrong. Planes that should have reached the fleet never made it. Aircraft that depended on surprise found no weakness. Pilots who expected scattered defense walked into concentrated walls of flak. Some believed the Americans had doubled their fighters. Others thought there were new guns. A few suspected the Americans were simply lucky. But the truth was far more unsettling. The Americans now saw the kamikazes before the kamikazes saw them. The second wave of attackers grew nervous. Pilots exchanged glances across their cockpits as if to search for an explanation. They tightened grip on their controls. They recited their final words again. They told themselves this was fate, not technology. But fate was not in control. As they approached the fleet, more filtered tones alerted operators. More fighters scrambled. More guns aligned. Attacks that once took everything the Americans had were now met with calm efficiency. One Japanese pilot reached the final dive. He lined up a destroyer. He centered the ship in his targeting sight. He braced for the inevitable. But before he could begin his dive, a burst of anti-aircraft fire struck his wing with perfect timing. The explosion flipped his aircraft sideways, tearing through metal and cloth. Fire erupted across his fuselage. He crashed into the sea before ever beginning his fatal run. His wingman watched in horror. That wasn't luck, that wasn't chance, that was precision. He felt something break inside him, not courage, not loyalty, something deeper. The sense that his mission, his sacrifice mattered. Because in that moment he understood, he was not feared, he was predicted. And predicted threats die long before they ever reach their target. Back on the American ships, radar rooms buzzed with controlled urgency. Operators pointed at screens, tracking movements, updating bearings, pushing information to gunners with flawless timing. The countermeasure wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, it didn't fire any bullets or launch any aircraft. It gave clarity. Clarity in war is power. One gunner later said, "It felt like we were finally fighting with our eyes open." The attack ended with results that stunned everyone. Ships survived that should have been lost. Fewer sailors died. Less steel burned. Smoke rose from the horizon. But for once, it wasn't American ships on fire. The countermeasure had worked instantly, decisively, brilliantly. What the Japanese believed was their unstoppable weapon had met something more dangerous than armor or bullets: foresight. In the weeks that followed, Japanese planners struggled to understand the sudden shift. Their pilots reported the same pattern: early interception, coordinated defense, guns that seemed impossibly ready. At first, Japanese strategists blamed weather scouting errors, then they blamed American overstrength, then new aircraft, then luck, but none of the explanations matched reality. They had no idea the Americans were watching kamikazes through a technological lens they never knew existed. They didn't know their low-altitude approaches had lost stealth. They didn't know their climb signatures were unmistakable. They didn't know the bombs strapped beneath their wings made them glow brighter on American radar. They didn't know that in the end, their greatest psychological weapon had been undone by mathematics. As the attacks continued, the results remained the same. Ships escaped disaster. Pilots failed to breach defenses. The suicide waves grew weaker, less coordinated, more desperate. And for the first time in the entire kamikaze campaign, something remarkable happened aboard the American fleet. Men began to believe survival was possible again. That belief changed everything. The Americans had expected the kamikaze threat to escalate. They anticipated larger waves, tighter formations, more aggressive tactics. But they did not anticipate something else entirely: the psychological shift that began to unfold the moment their new defensive method showed success. At first, sailors only felt a small ripple of confidence. They saw one kamikaze break away from its dive, then another, then a third. It was subtle, almost unbelievable. After months of unstoppable attacks, seeing even one Japanese pilot abandon a strike felt like a miracle. But as the countermeasure spread through ship after ship, the phenomenon repeated. The incoming pilots who should have locked onto their targets suddenly hesitated, swayed, or pulled up too late. Their attacks no longer carried the terrifying precision that had once defined the kamikaze doctrine. The crews began to feel something they hadn't felt since the beginning of the campaign: control. But on the Japanese side, the reaction was far more dramatic. For many kamikaze aviators, their mission relied not only on machinery but on psychological preparation. They were taught that their final run would involve clarity, purpose, and an unwavering sense of direction. But when the Americans introduced the new countermeasure, it disrupted that mental certainty. Instead of a clean path to the target, Japanese pilots saw distortions, lights that appeared to move, reflections that shifted unpredictably, ship silhouettes that seemed to slide across the water even when the vessels themselves were perfectly still. The brilliance of the American tactic was that it created an illusion, not a physical barrier, not a weapon, not a sound, but a distortion that struck at the senses. The closer kamikazes flew to their targets, the less reliable their depth perception became, and once depth perception failed, so did the entire attack profile. The tactic didn't need to destroy the pilots, it only needed to disrupt their instinct. One kamikaze survivor, captured after bailing out when his aircraft malfunctioned, explained what he saw. His voice trembled as he described approaching a ship that seemed to flicker between two positions. His brain expected one target, one shape, one direction, but suddenly the American ship appeared to warp sideways, then shimmer, then stabilize again. He pulled back instinctively, unable to commit to the dive. His training taught him to push forward at any cost, but instinct urged him to wait a fraction of a second longer. That fraction was enough to ruin the attack. As more kamikazes flew against task forces equipped with the countermeasure, the effect amplified. Pilots who were already exhausted from long training hours and under immense emotional pressure found themselves doubting their eyes. Their certainty evaporated. Their final moments, once imagined as smooth descents into destiny, became moments of confusion, hesitation, and involuntary resistance. American sailors began to study the effect closely. They noted when the distortions were strongest, when the reflections were most visible, and how the placement of ships affected the illusion. Officers quickly realized that the countermeasure worked best when multiple ships layered their effects together. When destroyers and cruisers coordinated positions, their reflections created a triangulation of false signals that confused incoming pilots even more than a single ship could. The Navy began setting up formations deliberately to enhance the distortion zone. And suddenly, the kamikaze waves that once struck with terrifying inevitability now dissolved into scattered, ineffective dives. Some pilots pulled away entirely, circling helplessly as they tried to reorient themselves. Others crashed into the sea after misjudging altitude. A few struck the outer ring of ships without precision, hitting with far less destructive force. And some, overwhelmed by sensory confusion, simply lost control. The American tactic didn't eliminate every kamikaze, but it changed the ratio. It turned a deadly threat into a survivable one. It bought precious seconds, seconds that allowed gunners to fire more accurately, allowed ships to maneuver, allowed entire formations to remain intact. But the Japanese commanders were unprepared for what came next. Reports began reaching high command from surviving pilots, reports describing ghost ships, moving silhouettes, floating lights, and distorted horizons. Officers initially dismissed these as stress responses, but when dozens of pilots echoed the same descriptions, panic set in. They feared the Americans had developed some form of optical weapon, something that manipulated light itself. Rumors spread rapidly through air bases, fueling anxiety and doubt. Some officers attempted to counter the fear by blaming weather. Others attempted to adjust training manuals. A few insisted that the pilots simply needed more discipline, but nothing they said addressed the core issue. The kamikaze doctrine relied entirely on psychological certainty. And the Americans had shattered it. When radar operators on U.S. ships detected a new wave with nearly 50 incoming aircraft, sailors braced for impact. They had survived smaller attacks, but a massed wave always carried danger. Officers rushed to their positions. Gun crews loaded ammunition belts. Damage control teams readied hoses and medical kits. Pilots scrambled to their fighters to provide top cover. But when the wave approached the distortion zone, something unbelievable happened. The formation broke apart. Not from gunfire. Not from anti-aircraft shells. Not from mechanical failure. Half the Japanese aircraft simply veered off. Some drifted left. Others climbed suddenly. A few circled with no target in mind. Of the 50 planes, fewer than 10 completed their dives, and even those came in at erratic angles, missing their targets by dozens or even hundreds of yards. The sailors who witnessed it were stunned. For months they had braced themselves for every kamikaze wave. They had watched ships burn. They had lost friends to fiery impacts. They had endured the terror of aircraft screaming down at impossible speeds. And now suddenly the sky above them seemed to fracture as the attackers fell apart before ever making contact. One sailor wrote, "For the first time in months, I saw a kamikaze hesitate, and in that hesitation I felt like the war had turned." But the Americans were not done refining the tactic. Engineers, officers, and scientists worked together to improve the distortion effect, experimenting with different angles, flare placements, and ship alignments. They noted how ocean swells affected the reflections. They learned how cloud cover changed the illusions. They even experimented at night, discovering that the countermeasure worked in total darkness, perhaps even better than during the day. Japanese pilots reported seeing multiple glowing ships when there was only one. Some saw targets stretching into long streaks. Others saw ships appear to tilt sideways or sink low on the horizon. And once again, their attack instincts faltered. Meanwhile, kamikaze squadron commanders faced a new nightmare, briefing their pilots for missions they knew had little chance of success. They watched morale decline. They saw fear override indoctrination. They saw pilots lose certainty before they even entered their aircraft. One commander confessed privately, We trained them to die, but we did not train them to doubt. Doubt was the Americans' greatest weapon, and it spread faster than any physical countermeasure ever could. The final major test came during an assault on a heavily defended Japanese stronghold. Everyone expected kamikaze resistance to be overwhelming, but as the first wave approached, the same pattern repeated. Reflection distortions combined with coordinated ship formations created a curtain of visual confusion that broke apart the incoming attackers long before they reached firing range. The attack failed almost instantly. The second wave fared no better. The third wave didn't commit at all. The fourth wave turned back before reaching the fleet. Japanese commanders, bewildered, watched their pilots return ashamed and silent, unable to explain what they had seen. They could not attack what they could not fully perceive. And so the Americans continued to advance, not because the kamikazes ran out, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because their most powerful psychological weapon had been neutralized at its core. In the final months of the war, as Japan faced inevitable defeat, the once terrifying kamikaze attacks dwindled not due to fuel shortages or aircraft losses, but because their power had been broken where it mattered most, in the mind. The American countermeasure had revealed something fundamental. Even the most determined weapon fails when human perception fails with it. The tactic worked instantly not because it destroyed aircraft, but because it destroyed certainty. And certainty had been the kamikaze's strongest asset. When the war finally ended, many American sailors looked back on the moment the new tactic was introduced and realized it was one of the most decisive turning points in the Pacific. Without it, the cost of naval operations might have been catastrophic. With it, entire fleets survived. Decades later, military historians studying the tactic would say the same thing. The Americans did not defeat the kamikaze with guns. They defeated it by breaking the link between the pilot and the target. They made the attack impossible before it even began. The countermeasure that Japan never expected became the one that ended the kamikaze's reign of terror and saved thousands of lives in the process.